If you want to learn how to make a top-down dungeon crawler, something inspired by classics like Gauntlet and even Diablo, something that has path-finding enemies, an area of effect explosions, something that was the beginning of my own dungeon crawler game, a top-down, couch co-op, action RPG with randomly generated levels and multiple player characters, then keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, and welcome back to our top-down dungeon crawler. In the last tutorial, we added a bomb to help the player destroy the enemies, but when you play the game, you realize the player can be easily trapped in a corner, or when you try to run through the enemies, they'll take a bite at you, and it's a little too easy to lose health that way. So playtesting your game is a great way to work out what's missing and what else is needed, and in this case, I think a dash would really help the player escape those situations. You can press space to initiate the dash, and you'll take no damage while you're dashing. Now we have a little animation that happens as you dash, so let's add that in this tutorial. So the first thing I'm going to do is just add that sprite. So if we go into our entity and our player and we look at our sprites, we have a walk sprite here. I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm just going to call this dash. Now if we go into that one, and we have all these frames, I'm just going to edit this. And I don't want all of them, I just want this one in the air. So I'm going to click on these, delete these ones. And for this one, if you hold down Control, you can select another color. I'm going to select this, and then I'm going to draw that just here, and then select this color, and just do it like that. Actually, we'll put this a little bit lower. And it kind of looks like the player's eyes are closed. So that's our dash animation. And now we can go into the player and we can add some variables in the create event. So I'm just going to go to the create event and we'll go to the step event, and I'll just make these bigger. We can just put this down here. Let's assign some variables, and this will be for our dash. So I want to have a speed that we're going to dash at. So I'll just call it dash speed, and we'll set that to 4. And then I want a dash array. And we'll just make that empty. So you can use the open bracket and a close bracket, and that'll create an empty array. Now an array is just like a variable. It stores values, but it can store multiple values. Now, what I mean by that is that if we have an array called dash array, and I store the values 4, 8, and 10. So now this array has 3 elements. And the first element is 4, second is 8, the third is 10. If I want to access those values, I can say dash array, and then the position of the value that I want to refer to. So if I say position 0, then that value will equal 4. And dash array position 1 will equal 8. And of course, dash array position 2 will equal 10. So the thing about arrays is that the values start counting at 0. So the index 0 is there, index 1, and index 2. Now in this case, we're going to use that array to store the position of where the player is, and then we'll be able to draw it and draw that ghost-like image as the player dashes. So I want another variable here, and we'll call this can dash, and we'll set it to true. And it's just like our can throw bomb. When can dash is true, it means we can dash at that time. So we also need a cooldown, so we can't just spam using the dash, and I'll set it to 120, which is 2 seconds. Now I'm going to set a dash timer initial, and I'll set it to 15, and then we'll set a dash timer, and we'll set that to the dash timer initial. So the dash timer is how long we'll stay in the dash state, and the initial value is what we always set it back to each time. So this time essentially is our iFrames, or our invulnerability frames, and it means that for this amount of time, the player will be invulnerable from damage if you choose to make them invulnerable while they're dashing, and I'll talk about that at the end of the video. So now that we've made our variables, let's go into our step event. And just here, after we are doing our aim for our bow, I'm going to copy this and then paste it. And I'm going to change this to check dash. And this is where we can check if the player wants to dash. So before we create this though, we need to capture a key that the player is using to dash. So if we go into our scripts and our get input, and just in here where we're capturing all our keys, let's go down the bottom and let's just capture a key pressed. So right here, let's put it a space, and if we've pressed space, then what we want to do is say that our dash variable is true. Now we need to initialize this dash variable. So if we go back in here where we are resetting our variables, and let's just add a new variable here called dash, and we'll set it to 0, which is basically the same as saying false. But because it's a true or false that we're checking for, I'm going to write false, but really it doesn't matter because 0 and false will be the same. Gamemaker will interpret those exactly the same. I just wanted to take a break and appreciate who makes these videos possible. This month, my legendary supporters are Big Honk, Jake Dowds, HK Pig, and Mark Savage. I've just released a new platformer course over on Udemy. All legendary supporters receive free codes to whatever my current courses are. So if you want to show your appreciation, you can do so over on the Patreon site. Now let's continue. So let's go and create our check dash function. Now mine hasn't named this correctly, so just make sure that is the same name, check dash. And I'm going to paste all of this code in here. So what we do here is we first check, has the player pressed dash, and can they dash at this point in time? If they can, then we move to a dash state. Now we'll need to go create this in our states enums. I set the dash timer to the initial value. We get the direction that the player is currently moving, and we do that with a point direction function. And because hmove and vmove are basically the directions we're moving, we can do it from 0, 0, and that'll give us the direction. So it doesn't matter that we're not basing it on where the player's position is. Doing it from 0, 0 and the movement values like this will give us the direction they're moving. And then we use a function called length_x, and that'll get the distance based on a length and a direction. So if we're moving in a certain direction, based on this speed that we're moving, we can calculate the horizontal distance that we're moving. And we're going to store that in our HSP, and we do the same thing with a length_y function, and that'll get the VSP or the vertical distance that we need to move. And lastly, we just initialize that array so we're ready to use it. And we do that with the square brackets. So open square bracket, close square bracket, and then we end up with an empty array. Now let's go and create this enum for the dash. So just in our macros and our enums, and we can just add one on the bottom here for dash. So back in our step event, where we're doing our check dash here, I'm going to close this down a little bit, and we need a new case for a dash state. So let's go here, and we need a case, and this time it's states.dash. And I'm going to add all of this code. So the first thing we want to do is just reset our variables like normal. And next, I'm going to use a function called array push. And this adds a value to an array. So the array we're going to add is to dash array, and I'm going to add this funky thing. Now, this is a struct. And a struct is a variable that can hold multiple other variables. And you can name the variables that you're storing. And the great thing about structs and variable names is they're independent to the struct. which means that you can name them things like X, Y, and you can use keywords inside the struct. So for the X variable, I'm going to store the player's X position, and we'll store the player's Y position and an image alpha value. So basically what we're doing is recording where the player is as they move, and we'll draw that position each step to make it look like the player is dashing. Now we'll also store an image alpha value, and we'll decrease this over time, and we'll use that to make it look like the player is fading out in those positions. Now we want to move the HSP and the VSP position per step to make the dash happen. So we'll set our X position to be HSP relative, and that'll add HSP to our X, and we're going to add VSP to our Y. Now, when we're in the dash state, we want to leave the state eventually, and we use our dash timer to find out when that happens. So we'll take 1 from dash timer each step, and once it's less than or equal to 0, it's time to leave the dash state. So then we'll go back to the move state. We'll set our HSP and our VSP to 0. We'll say that our Ken dash is now false. And in order to set it to true again, we'll set an alarm value to our dash cooldown. Now, instead of using an alarm number, I'm using a macro here called Ken dash. So after this, we'll go and create that. And this is a great way to do it, because then if you're ever looking in your code whereabouts you've set that alarm, you can just search for the macro name, and then you can find all the references. And lastly, I'm going to set the image index to 2. And that's because the dash animation we used was image index 1 from the walk animation. So once it finishes, then the walk will be seamless and it'll just continue to walk. Now, after the check, if we don't do the check, then I still want to do an aim bow and an anim, just so we are setting the player's aiming position and also doing the animations like we would normally. So let's just go into our macros, and we'll create this Ken dash. And we'll just have to look at the player and see that our Ken dash is going to be alarm 3. And inside here, we can actually just set our Ken dash, and we'll set it to 3. Now I did leave one here blank, and this is our Ken throw bomb. And we should have set this up before, but we'll set it up to 2, and we can just go in there and just make sure we're using that in the right position. So just inside our check bomb where we're setting the cooldown. So just here, we should have had our Ken throw bomb as the alarm value. Now back in the player, let's create that alarm 3. And all we want to do is just reset our Ken dash value to true. So let's press play. We'll check that out. So now when we press space, the player dashes. Now you notice a couple of things happen. Well, firstly, there's no animation. And secondly, there's no way to know when we can press space again, when we can dash again. So let's fix that up. First thing I want to do is just add a little flash so we know that we can press space. I just wanted to pause for a moment and acknowledge the epic Patreon supporters for this month. They are Skydevil Palm, Paul Alablank, Robert Churches, Sir Peter, Chris LeBlanc, Dennis Evans, Alex Bukowski, Eric Justin, Joseph Camello, Cloudy, Marlo Dobb, Jargon P, Raymond Holler, Don Brule, Robert Lopez, Logan H, Scott J, and Potax. Thank you for being an epic supporter and making this content possible. Now back to the tutorial. So if we go into our entity parent, and I'm going to go to the create event and just add here where we're talking about our flash. I'm going to add a show flash variable, and I'll just set it to 4. Now let's go to our draw event. And where we're doing our check here, because we actually flash when we get damaged, so we can sort of piggyback on top of that, and we'll flash a little bit as well when the player is ready to use their dash. So if we put all of this in a bracket, we can also say that we want to flash when our show flash minus minus is greater than 0. And then we'll get 4 steps where the flash will happen. So back in our player, And in the alarm here, now we can just use this to set our show flash, and we'll say show flash is back to 4. Now you'll notice that I use the value 4 twice, and I always say this to you, if you're going to add these magic numbers, it's better to not do that. It's better to have them as a value that you set in the create event. And I wanted to show you that you can do this, but it might get complicated if you want to change the value, because then you've got to change it in 2 locations. So what I should do is say show flash initial. And this is something I try to be consistent with. So if we go back to our create event here, and instead of making it 4, we have a show flash, and we'll set it to show flash initial. And this one for our show flash initial is 4. So that way we can always set it to the initial value, and we only ever have to change it in this one location. So now if we do our dash, and we should see that our player flashes, there we go, when dash is ready to be used. Great. So the only other thing we want to do is actually draw that dash animation. So let's go to our draw event here, and let's go down here. This is where we're drawing the sprite. Now I don't want to do this inside the entity parent, because if we do it here, then it has to be processed for the enemies as well. So let's go to our player. And at the moment, you can see we're inheriting the draw event from oEntityParent. So I'm going to right click and inherit this event. And what that'll do is make our own draw event for the player, and we are calling the parent event. So we're calling the entity parent event here. But I want to draw the dash event first. I want to draw the dash animation under the player. So I'm going to move this down to the bottom, and I'm going to put the code for drawing the dash animation above it. So now I'm just going to paste in the animation code. So the call parent event is down the bottom, and what we've pasted here is basically some code to draw the dash animation. So the first thing we do is we get the length of our array. I'm just going to store that in the variable called size. And then we want to loop through the array, and we want to draw each element. So we start at the end of the array, which is size -1, because the size is always 1 bigger than where you want to start, because we start at position 0. And as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, we can process this loop, and we make sure we decrease I by 1 each step. And that way we're basically starting at the end of the array, and we're drawing each element before it. Now the first thing I want to do is look at that I element in the array, look at the image alpha value, and decrease it by a small amount. That means that we're slowly fading it out. And then we're going to check if that image alpha value is greater than 0. And if it is, well, that means we want to draw it. So we draw the sprite, we draw our dash sprite at our X value, and then our Y value +2. And I'm adding 2 because the way that the dash sprite was set, it's a little higher because it's basically the player jumping in the air when they're running. So just putting it at +2 will make it look better when you draw it. Make sure we add our facing, so we're going to draw it at the right orientation. And then we just use that image alpha value for the alpha of the sprite. Now, if we don't end up drawing this, if our image alpha is actually 0 or less, well, then we no longer need that element in the array. So we can run an array delete, and we can delete that I value. Now, when you are deleting elements from an array, you want to run it backwards like this. You want to start at the end of the array and then move to the first one. And the reason is, if you delete them, you're going to get in some strife, because if you're increasing it and going through the array from the start to the end and you delete an element, well, it throws out your numbers here. So you always just start at the end and then go backwards to element 0. And that's all there is to it. So let's press play and test that out. So now when we dash, we get a nice little streak behind the player, and they flash white when they're ready to dash again. So when you get stuck, you can sort of throw your bombs down, but if you want to dash, you can do so. Now you will notice that when you're dashing, you can still take damage. So I've left that in, but it's up to you. If you want to enable the player not to get damage while they're dashing, you can do that. And if you want to do that, you can just go to where the player takes damage. And here where we're checking if hurt is greater than 0 or the state is dead, what you could do is just change this and put this in brackets and say state equals dead or state equals states dot dash. Now, actually, we don't need the brackets here because we're using 2 ors, but I'm just doing this because these are state checks, so I'm putting them all together. So if we're in a dash state, then we won't take any damage. The last thank you is to my rare Patreon members who generously have given to help keep the tutorials flowing. So that's all for this tutorial. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you in the next one.